Well, it's less of a horror movie and more of a thriller, police, crime, procedural kinda. That was a sentence I've said multiple times to multiple people throughout the past 2 weeks when talking both about the movies Maxxxine and Longlegs. Both movies have received varied responses from audiences. Longlegs is mostly positive, but a lot of people are saying they feel misled by the marketing, thinking it would have been scarier. And a lot of people are disappointed by Maxxxine because it's, well, the third movie in a horror movie franchise, and I guess people expected it to be more scary, have more kills, more blood, gore. And I get it. The promotion for Longlegs was basically telling you you'd poop your pants and pee your pants and call your mom to come pick you up from the theater because you'll be so scared. And the marketing for Maxxxine was actually, rewatching the trailer, it's like, yeah, that's kind of what the movie is. There's a little maybe too much emphasis on the Night Stalker stuff, but overall, I don't feel too misled. But what I do feel misled by was that this one tweet saying that it's gonna be a whodunit slasher. It's not a whodunit. I wouldn't categorize it as that. What these movies do have in common is that they were both marketed as horror movies. One is about an FBI agent trying to hunt a serial killer, and the other is about an actress trying to become a star, while in the background, the police are trying to hunt a serial killer. And the fact that I said to multiple people, well, it's less horror and more police stuff. Well, what even is horror in the first place? What makes a horror movie a horror movie? Take a second right now, in your head, or maybe even just type it in the comments, maybe. What do you think makes a horror movie a horror movie? In order for a movie to be a horror movie, do people have to die? If so, how many? Does a horror movie need a serial killer in it? A monster? Does it need gore? Or does it just need to evoke fear? Just no matter what it is, no matter what the content is, as long as it makes you afraid, is it a horror movie? Is genre defined by the plot elements within a movie or defined by the emotion it makes you feel? All the elements I listed out, there are movies that have those things that aren't horror movies. There are movies where people die. Those aren't horror movies. You have movies where there's a serial killer. Those aren't horror movies. You have movies with a gore. Those aren't horror movies. And then what about something that makes you scared but isn't a horror movie? Do those exist? Let's just think in the reverse for a second. We know that there are horror movies that don't make you scared. I'm sure you can list a few in your head or in the comments right now. What's a horror movie you watched where you weren't scared? Maybe it was Longlegs or Maxxxine. Maybe it was Night Swim, Megan, Imaginary. All of those are horror movies, and then I guess it was subjective to whether or not you were scared by them. But we see them as horror movies because, well, Blumhouse made them, so. I joke, but we'll get back to that point later in the video. For now, let's think back on movies that make you scared but aren't horror movies. Maybe a good example of this is war movies. Those movies have gore, those movies have people dying, it's loud noises, and it portrays the horrors of war. So, are war movies horror movies? Well, there's this beautiful thing called a genre, which says a war movie is just a war movie. That's what it's called, if it's a war movie. Another example is Shiva Baby. A lot of people online call this a horror movie, myself included. You know why? Because when I was watching it, I pooped my pants, I peed my pants, and I called my mom to come pick me up from the theater. That's how fast my heart was racing. My heart, while watching Shiva Baby, probably did go to 165, or whatever Micah Monroe's was, okay? No one died, there was no gore, there's no monsters or killers around. It was just a person attending a Shiva, and then everything going wrong. But it made me feel. Where am I going with this? Let's go back to the question. Is genre defined by the plot or the emotions it makes you feel? Well, let's put our scholarly caps on. I guess I'm already wearing a hat. And look at some definitions for horror movies by scholars. Cambridge defines a horror movie as a movie in which very frightening or unnatural things happen. For example, dead people coming to life and people being murdered. Britannica defines it as calculated to cause intense repugnance, fear, or dread. Horror films may incorporate incidents of physical violence and psychological terror. They may be studies of deformed, disturbed, psychotic, or evil characters, stories of terrifying monsters or malevolent animals, or mystery thrillers that use atmosphere to build suspense. The genre often laps with science fiction and film noir. And lastly, Oxford defines it as a large, heterogeneous group of films that, via representation of disturbing and dark subject matter, seek to elicit responses of fear, terror, disgust, shock, suspense, and of course, horror from their viewers. If it's been a while since you've been in an English class or science class, let me help you on the definition of heterogeneous. It's, different in kind, unlike, incongruous, composed of different parts of different kinds, having widely dissimilar elements or constituents. This is why I like Oxford's definition the most, because they acknowledge it is made up of a bunch of different films that are widely different from each other, but what they all have in common is the representation of disturbing and dark subject matter. Well, I raise you this question now. What is disturbing and dark subject matter? For our case study here, we're going to look at comedy zombie movies. Would you define any of these movies as horror movies, or are they just comedy movies that happen to have zombies in them? Just because a movie has a zombie in it, does that automatically make it a horror movie? Well, according to these definitions, zombies can technically be described as unnatural, disturbing, and incite physical violence. So, yes, if there's a zombie in your movie, that's a horror movie, right? Well, that's also wrong, because what we've left out of this conversation so far, we've only talked about plot and emotions. What about the technical elements of a film? Zombies aren't scary if you portray them using this kind of lighting, costumes, makeup, acting, writing, or directing choices. But they are scary when you use these lighting, costumes, makeup, acting, and writing, directing choices. What's going on here? What is horror? Well, horror is a genre, so let's look at the definition of a genre. Oregon State University did a video about this, which I watched and found very insightful, so I'll link it below. But basically, the definition they use is, genre is what some might call typified rhetorical action. And what that means is there are features that repeat again and again over time with few differences, in part because audience expect certain things to happen because they want certain kinds of experiences. Horror movies are made in a way to elicit fear. Like, if Longlegs just wanted to be a straight-up police procedural drama about an FBI investigating a serial killer, well then, it wouldn't really have that nighttime scene where Lee gets a letter in the middle of the night, and it's framed in a certain way, it's lit really dark, you're scanning the background to see if anything's behind her. It wouldn't be shot like that. But since it is shot like that, and that kind of framing makes you scared, it makes it a horror movie. So in the genre of horror, there are these repeated rhetorical actions that both happen in the plot and behind the camera. For instance, yes, there are a bunch of horror movies about serial killers, and they also use technical elements like the point of view shot from the killer's perspective. That's what I was talking about earlier about Blumhouse. And because, yeah, it's a horror studio and they all want a certain look for their films and to have sort of a brand image that people can follow along with. Sure, there's the occasional outlier, but as of late, their movies have been a little similar If you want to hear me talk about that more, check out the video I did on tarot. But what about the horror movies that break the genre, that break out of the conventions, I hear you say? The movies that don't rely on dark lighting, they're bright and colorful, like Pearl. Well, that kind of movie relies on the psychological terror aspect that the Britannica definition was talking about. And now we're getting into the conversation of what's a psychological thriller? What about elevated horror? I hate the term elevated horror. It's either scary or it's not. Whatever means it uses to make you scared, it doesn't matter. Okay? Is a horror movie defined by its plot elements, by its technical elements, by just the emotion it evokes? Well, all three. Some movies only have one of those things, some movies have two of those things, some movies have all three. For example, let's say you didn't find the movie Megan scary. It still has the plot conventions of a horror movie, and it's still shot like one. On the other hand, there's Shiva Baby, which did make me feel scared, but it doesn't have the plot conventions of horror, and for the technical aspects, well, it is made in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. So maybe that part can be debated upon because it's us, as society, the members of society who deem whether or not a movie is horror or not, what the repeated rhetorical actions of a horror movie are, and if it fits into them, great, that's a horror movie. And if it doesn't fit into them, well, it's either some genius, genre-bending subversion, or it's just a disappointment in the eyes of fans. I hope you liked this video. Let me know what your definition of horror is in the comments, and if you've made it this far, I'm assuming you like horror videos. Good thing I have an entire playlist of them. So go check that out, and I'll see you guys next time. Different in kind, unlike, incongruous, composed of different parts of different kinds, having widely dissimilar elements. Different in kind, unlike, incongruous, composed of different parts of different kinds, having widely dissimilar elements or constituents. Okay.